Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Theology in the Raw. I'm here with Helena, and I feel like I need to give just a brief backstory. I've been watching lots of videos and testimonies from Helena for a couple years. Helena kind of doesn't have a clue who I am. So she said she was kind of nervous coming on like a religious podcast. And those of you who follow this podcast and YouTube channel are probably laughing at her nervousness because some of you are nervous about religious podcasts as well. So I just want you to, in your own private moment, give a huge warm welcome to Helena. Helena, seriously, thanks so much for being on this show. I'm so excited to finally talk to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm really interested and excited and curious about how this is going to go. I really like talking about a lot of this stuff. So,
Yeah. And just maybe just to set my just to get stuff out of the way for my audience, like you do have a Catholic slash religious ish background, but you don't have like a explicit Christian commitment now.
yeah.
100% fine. My audience will be like yawning, like, great, yeah, me too, you know. But just so my audience knows that that's where Helen is coming from. So why don't you? I want to talk about your story as it pertains to the broader transgender conversation, but more in particular, the for those who might know the term, the rapid onset gender dysphoria, or let's just forget terminology because that can be problematic. But just there has been a massive increase among teenagers, especially biological female teenagers identifying as trans or non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, and that's raised a lot of debates and conversations, and some have been really volatile. And your story really does, it kind of intersect with that in really amazing ways. So why don't we just go back, and I would love to hear your story and how you ended up identifying as trans, went down that route for a little bit, and then ended up coming back and leaving behind that identity. Is that a good place to start? Is that a good way to set it up?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll try to give like a brief overview because it's actually like 5+ years of just complete crazy. So when I was about 14, I was going through a period of my life that was pretty difficult. I was having a really hard time at school. I wasn't making good grades. I was being kind of like bullied and ostracized by mainly other girls, but some boys too. And I ended up actually leaving school in the second semester of my freshman year of high school and just being at home, going to work with my mom and stuff like that while we tried to figure out what to do for my next year of school. And I was doing a lot of school online. And so during this time, and specifically over the summer, right before my freshman year, and then leading into that period where I wasn't at school, I started using Tumblr a lot. So I was spending a lot of time alone, a lot of time on my computer. I was really unhappy, and I just felt really, really lonely and alone. So I started using Tumblr, and at first it was just to look at stuff that I was interested in. So at the time, I was just like a little Christian girl. I really liked classic rock. I liked the Beatles. I liked Elvis. I was really into like old Hollywood movies and stuff. Like I was very time warped. I would do like pin curls in my hair and stuff. I was like totally obsessed with that. And so I got on Tumblr because there was a small community of other like young girls who were similarly just weird and into that kind of thing. There wasn't a lot of us, I promise, but there was that little community of like 14, 15-year-old girls who were obsessed with the Beatles. And so it started off just me being in that community. But as I kind of started seeing what other interests people were having, like what books they were reading, what shows they were watching, I started branching out into some of that other stuff. And then as I started enjoying a lot of this new content and this new media, I started following more people and branching outside of that tight-knit community of time warped teenagers, because they were not social justice warriors. They were not, I guess, politically conservative, but there wasn't a lot of interest in all the gender nonsense. Like we were very much kind of like had a respect for the olden days, I guess. And so as I got really into Harry Potter and a couple of BBC shows, and so I started following that kind of stuff. I really expanded what I was looking at, and that's when kind of the social justice stuff started coming into my worldview, my attention. And at first, I thought it was very, I just didn't understand it. It wasn't a point of view that I was really familiar with. I learned about civil rights when I was in school and stuff, and I kind of thought that was behind us.
Mm-hmm.
And then all this stuff started kind of hitting me. And there's a lot of stuff saying like, oh no, racism is still a huge issue. Racism is still like the biggest issue that America is facing. Homophobia is the biggest issue. Transphobia is the biggest issue. And so I kind of started feeling really guilty that I had ignored these apparently huge issues. And so I started educating myself more. And so I just went deeper and deeper and deeper into learning about all this social justice stuff. I made it a point to make social justice something that I talked about a lot because I felt like it was my duty as a straight, cisgender, white girl. And so once I had already fully adopted that kind of social justice worldview, then I started seeing these other young girls on Tumblr who identified as non-binary, trans, what have you. And instead of seeing them as other and weird, because I'd become so acclimated to the worldview in which transphobia and trans people and gender are such a big deal, I started being able to relate to what they were saying about their bodies and their lives and their mental health and how they were relating that to being trans. And I started making that connection personally for myself that I might be trans. So that's kind of how I started identifying as trans. It started out with me identifying as non-binary. So first I called myself a demi-girl, which if you're unfamiliar with like all the crazy gender stuff, that just means you're like 90% girl, 10% not girl.
Okay.
So do with that what you want.
Just to clarify too, from my audience, when you say 90%, girl, 10% not girl, you're not talking about like a biological sex. You're not talking like about like an intersex or medical condition where you have some ambiguity in your biology. You're talking about like, I mean, I don't know how else to frame it, but like you might resonate with gender stereotypes more on one end than the other. I mean, is it more complex than that? Or is that basically at the end of the day kind of what's going on there? Like,
that's basically a way that you can look at it, but it's less because the relationship that this worldview has to gender stereotypes is not as cut and dry as some outsiders make it seem. It's more like gender or how you identify as is your subjective experience. You define it however you want. If you personally define it along the lines of gender stereotypes, that's valid. But if you define it some other way, that's valid too. The whole point is that there is no objective standard or definition for these genders, and they're all a personal subjective experience.
Oh, that's helpful. Yeah. Okay.
When I said I was 90% girl, in my head, obviously I was connecting it to gender stereotypes, but that's not really how I thought about it at the time. I thought that like whatever girl meant, I related to it a lot, but not 100%. So I wasn't sitting there saying, oh, well, okay, so I like wearing makeup, but I don't like this or that. I wasn't doing that kind of math that way. It was purely just kind of like my personal emotions towards the idea of girl.
Okay. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
And would you say you I'm sorry, I want you to keep going through your story. I keep interrupting you, but would you say you experienced gender dysphoria at that time, or a mild form of it, or?
At that time, no, not really. So the closest thing that I experienced to gender dysphoria by that point was just kind of being uncomfortable with my body, not specifically like the sexed aspect of my body, but just my body in general. I was a little bit overweight, and that was like the bane of my existence. I really despised my weight and my appearance at that time. So I had a huge problem with that. And I've always just been very reserved with my body. And I didn't like the fact that I was getting sexual attention, both from boys my age, but also like occasionally like the random skeevy drunk dude. I absolutely hated it. It grossed me the hell out. And the only other thing that I would say I won't call it gender dysphoria because I think they're very normal experiences and they shouldn't be pathologized as gender dysphoria. But with the addition of the ideology, it ended up morphing into actual gender dysphoria. But so when I was a little kid, I was super like rambunctious and crazy. And I had a very like domineering attitude, and I just didn't really get along with other girls that well. Like they didn't like me. And so I kind of ended up gravitating towards a lot of young boys. And that was
Mhm.
kind of who I was friends with. And we would be doing crazy stuff, getting on our teachers' nerves, like trying to be as outlandish and crazy and destructive and rambunctious as possible. I just found that very fun. I found their style of playing a lot more fun than what I was
Yeah.
seeing girls do, like kind of just sitting around on the playground and talking as opposed to like playing. And so as I kind of grew into puberty, the the weird feelings about my body kind of made the experience of puberty even worse because I started noticing that my male friends were kind of looking at me differently now. Like it was
Mhm.
kind of this transition from we're all kids, we're all just doing whatever, it's fine, it's chill, to oh, now like you're a girl and your body is so different and like you're like this is so different.
Hmm.
And not that any of them were ever mean to me or anything. It was just like you just kind of the road diverges a
Mhm.
little bit,
Mhm.
or at least it's supposed to, and I didn't want to go the way in which I was seeing girls go, so
Hmm.
that was really stressful for me. um,
Okay.
but I think that's pretty normal.
Yeah, yeah. I don't. You don't know this, but I've got 3 teenage daughters, and I don't. Yeah, I mean, based on personal experience, based on who I talk to, I think just especially for females for some reason. I mean, true for males too. But going through puberty is not easy at all. Like, especially in this day
Mhm.
and age, in our Instagram photoshopped day and age, there's just so much pressure. And again, I think it is
Yeah.
more for females. I don't think that's an inaccurate assumption, but my gosh, it's brutal. um,
Yeah.
I know very few females who, oh, I love getting my period for the first time. Oh, I love my developing body. Oh, I love this attention I'm getting from creeps. And it's just, it's anyway, it's extremely difficult. But and I speak obviously from somebody looking from the outside. But
Hmm.
yeah. So I want to keep going. What yeah. So you started noticing on Tumblr and Reddit and stuff some trans people talking about their experience, and you started to resonate with that. Would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so it's very difficult to explain the kind of dynamics that there are on Tumblr. The way that I look at it is Tumblr specifically is a universe of its own. Like it is its own little world. They have their own almost like society with
Huh.
its own hierarchies and its own classes and social structures and customs and traditions, and
Huh.
it's very much just like this alternate universe. And so that does come into play with part of the reason why I was so inclined to interpret myself through the lens of how these other trans identified girls were interpreting themselves. Because it's very difficult to explain. There's kind of a little bit of a tradition on Tumblr of romanticizing and glorifying different dysfunctional ways of dealing with emotional distress. So, like, one that people are a little bit more familiar with is like the self harm trend.
Mm-hmm.
So back in like around 2008, 2009, 2010, it was a really big trend on Tumblr for mainly young girls, but some young boys too, to self harm themselves and then make artistic photos and videos and GIFs of
Wow.
the graphic self harm that they were doing. And this was a very robust community of people that were doing this. People had entire blogs dedicated to doing this to themselves and sharing the art that other people were making with it. And it's actually, there's a lot of research done into it that it correlates with the rise in self harm in young girls, that it's like a social contagion, similarly to the
Yeah.
trans thing. But there's something that really appeals to young girls, especially on Tumblr, about taking all of your teenage angst and kind of funneling it into this very romanticized, idealized, almost artistic, almost spiritual way of
Hmm.
handling it and of expressing it.
Okay.
So similarly to like the kind of self-harm thing, now it's like the same mechanism of people doing that, but it's with gender dysphoria. So you have these girls just like very overtly romanticizing the fact that they're trans and how hard it is to be trans and how they wear their binders for 16 hours a day and it hurts and they can't breathe, but they do it anyway. And it's just like this very, I don't know, there's something very collective and like I said, almost spiritual about the way that they approach their distress using these mechanisms. And so as I was observing this, I was feeling myself having an intense desire to participate in that.
Hmm.
And I was just looking at how much fun they seemed to be having, bonding socially over this shared pain and this kind of like shared self-destruction that they also glamorize as being, you know, like becoming your authentic self, living your truth, like, oh, it's so hard to describe. But I was observing that and I really just wanted to take part in it. And it seemed like the way that they were handling it, they were developing a community, they were finding meaning, they were finding purpose, and they were having the same exact kind of problems that I was having. So they were interpreting the fact that they hated their weight, they hated their breasts, they hated being hit on by drunk dudes. They didn't fit in, they were bullied, they were ostracized, they, you know, had different interests, and this made them feel othered. They were taking all of these experiences that I was having and they were putting it into this romantic, heroic construct of this trans identity within this worldview of social justice where trans people are the martyrs, the victims, but also like the people that you need to look up to and give to and support. So that's my really weird, complicated explanation of how that happened, but I hope it made any sense.
And did you, so you ended up fully identifying as, you said first non-binary and then trans, and then did you begin to transition on some level, or?
Yeah. So at first, like I said, it was demigirl, and then I switched to agender, which means you have no gender. I felt very special for that at the time. And then around my junior year of high school, so this was maybe like a year and a half to 2 years into identifying as trans in the first place, then I started identifying as a trans guy, a trans man, a trans male, what have you. And this, I believe, is because I actually started developing gender dysphoria. So all of those kind of body image issues that I was talking about before, and that feeling of just not fitting in with girls, and as a child especially preferring to be around boys so much, that feeling was something that the identity and the ideology really magnified. So that feeling is what tied me to my community of other trans-identified girls. So despite the fact that I was kind of using the trans identity to cope with it, it also became very magnified because of how important it was to maintaining that social circle. And so I started shifting from hating my hips because they were fat to hating my hips because they were female. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I'm sort of. Yeah, I could see the difference. I could cognitively notice the difference, but experientially, yeah, there's going to be a distance. But that's it. So I mean, I don't want to jump. I want you to keep telling your story, but when I hear your kind, and your story is not, your story is your story, and I want to, I guess, reemphasize that. Like, this is descriptive, not prescriptive. This is one story, and one story is one story, and yet your story is very similar to many stories I feel like I keep hearing. And my question, well, I've got about 1,000 questions, but the line between gender dysphoria and simply body dysmorphia, or some kind of uncomfortableness with your emerging body, especially teenage females, that's kind of blurry, especially from somebody on the outside looking on. It's like, you know, I'm developing breasts and I'm uncomfortable. I don't like guys looking at me. I don't like the fact that I have a period. My hips are getting, my legs are getting, I feel uncomfortable. I feel a little overweight. Like all these things I keep hearing older cisgender women kind of shrugging their shoulders and saying, welcome to womanhood. And yet there is something distinct called gender dysphoria. And yet when you describe gender, it's almost like it was kind of nurtured, brought on even, and nurtured by your social environment. So it's hard for me looking on from the outside to understand the stark difference between gender dysphoria and just simply body dysmorphia and simply being a teenage female in 2020.
Yeah.
Is that, what am I missing? Or is my confusion somewhat legitimate, or?
No, you're actually not missing anything. And you're looking at this in a much more correct way than a lot of the people who talk about gender dysphoria do. Because there is an inherent problem in the diagnosis of gender dysphoria as it is listed in the DSM, where the symptoms that are supposed to make up gender dysphoria are so broad and so commonly experienced that technically you can have someone who, you know, like I have friends who are transitioning, they identify as trans, and they have like literally, I don't know how else to describe it, but the way that their mind projects their body is the opposite sex, to which like they literally, like there's just something where they don't register themselves as the sex that they were born as, and they never ever have.
Right.
And they tell me about how like being a child, they were just like confused, not so much like distressed and suicidal and all this stuff that the trans activists try to play up, but just like they always interpreted themselves as the opposite sex. So you can have someone like that technically be diagnosed with the same exact thing as someone like me, who I didn't have that. I just had discomfort with my body that I later retroactively interpreted as discomfort with my sex. And so when we have this diagnosis of gender dysphoria that is so broad, this is kind of the logical conclusion where we're going to have people who are having perfectly normal experiences being pathologized as having a legitimate mental disorder, and gender dysphoria in, you know, like kind of the way that I would prefer it be looked at, is a mental disorder. And there's even evidence. I wish I remembered who did this study, but there was a study that was looking at the neurology of people with gender dysphoria and found that they actually had differences in their brains in the areas that map like your spatial understanding. So how you understand where your body is in space and time. People with gender dysphoria actually have neurological differences in that part of the brain. So there is some truth to the fact that they're literally just interpreting themselves differently than someone without gender dysphoria. So that's a completely different situation than what I went through. And a lot of people don't like the diagnosis of gender dysphoria because it is, it's conflating something that actually might be a psychological or even a neurological disorder with perfectly normal experiences that are just part of growing up and getting used to your body and your social situation.
So I've got a few friends. What you're saying makes absolutely perfect sense. To from what I've learned over the years by talking to people. I mean, I've got friends who have had lifelong, innate, early onset gender dysphoria, as opposed to adolescent onset gender dysphoria. These are kind of two broad categories psychologists make. I mean, early onset can come, it can be experienced as early, I think, as 2 or 3 years old, where the very earliest manifestations and experience of one's own sexed body and gender role, gender identity, whatever, has been of the opposite sex. And oftentimes, according to the studies, right, I mean, that can go away after adolescence, but for those that it doesn't, that it remains profound, innate, I mean, severe, for lack of better terms. I could think right now, 1, 2, 3 friends of mine who have that story. And when they hear stories of people, maybe like yourself, or people who have gone through this kind of like more social contagion, and I want to come back to that term too and hear your thoughts on that. They just have no they're like, I don't resonate with that at all. For me, being trans was not a glorified experience. It wasn't
Yeah.
I wasn't socialized into it. It was something that I hated. I wanted to go away. I've only felt from within, and it's just very different. And yet, I think what you're saying is that currently the medical diagnosis doesn't really distinguish between those two. Would that be correct? That there is a sloppiness that might be a little strong. Maybe it's not too strong. I'll let you put whatever word you want. There's the medical field, and perhaps because of politics, is not distinguishing between these two kind of somewhat different, maybe very different strands of gender dysphoria. Would that be accurate, or would love to hear your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that this is very politically motivated because I don't know. Are you familiar with the fact that it was changed from gender identity disorder
Sure.
to gender dysphoria?
2013.
So
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And that's 2013 is actually incidentally the year when the spike in adolescent girls looking to transition skyrocketed.
Yeah.
So it makes sense that broadening that diagnosis would correlate with. Sorry, my cat is like.
You can bring your cat in if your cat could totally be in the show if you want.
Hey, buddy. Well, he'll come back. He'll definitely be back.
I want to see your cat before the show's over.
Sure. He likes ignoring me until I'm recording. But so it makes sense that broadening that definition, that diagnosis of dysphoria, and changing it from something that is focused on the overall incongruence, that like profound and total incongruence between the self-perception and the physical reality, to a model of individual experiences of distress. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so
totally, yeah.
Seeing it as a profound and total incongruence between. Sorry, hold on. Jesus. Okay, I'll start my sentence over.
That's so funny. You're awesome.
Like, so I live in a really small apartment, so I try to find him as much stimulation as I can. And so the way I feed him is I put his kibble in like a little ball, and then he rolls it around, and I didn't want to be talking with him like slamming this ball against the wall.
Oh, that's so funny. That's
awesome. Oh shoot, what was my last sentence?
Yeah. You're describing kind of people that experience kind of this periodic discomfort versus this kind of total innate ongoing. Yeah.
Or even just like individual aspects of discomfort. So what I classified as dysphoria was, at times hating my breasts, wishing I had a flat chest, fantasizing about how freeing it might be to be flat-chested and male and be able to wear loose tank tops and just like feel the wind on my skin, and just like fantasizing about stuff like that. And or like fantasizing about just different experiences that I thought I might be able to have if I were male, or disliking a certain part of my body, so I coped with that by wishing that it was like the male version of that body part, as opposed to just like a complete identity mismatch.
Yeah.
So I think like that has to be a distinction. And especially if there's research showing that people with that kind of gender dysphoria have neurological differences, like we have to be aware of these differences and these distinctions, because that might be the difference between someone who finds relief in a cosmetic physical transition versus someone who needs therapeutic help.
Thank you for that. That's super helpful. You made a reference to, you've used the phrase social contagion. I think most of the people listening can probably understand what that means. But you know this, but just so my audience knows this, like that, the idea that gender dysphoria could be a result of social contagion, that's super volatile right now. I mean, that can get you canceled, it can get you blasted, can get hate mail, maybe even death threats. Can you, and yeah, I hear you saying that for your individual experience, and I think you would say probably for other friends of yours and other people that you know in your community, or maybe a community that you used to be a part of, you would say that at least for some people, maybe a lot of people, social contagion has played a role, if not a causative role, in the gender
Yes.
dysphoria. Can you just, I just want you to just unpack that for us. What is social contagion? How did it play a role in your story? And do you think that this is a factor in especially teenage females identifying as trans today?
Hmm. So, social contagion is a very well documented phenomenon, especially in the case of adolescent females. This population is well known throughout history to have these kind of socially contagious methods for understanding distress. And that's really what it's based in. It's a way of understanding your distress in a way that connects you to other people. And this can be observed in anorexia and bulimia. This can be observed in self-harm. This can be observed in, like the witchcraft crazes and various psychiatric crazes. This capacity for young girls who are going through unbelievably confusing amounts of chaotic emotions. And oftentimes, if they don't have a supportive parental figure who is attuned to their emotions and is handling them in the right way that matches their needs, they're going to look for an alternative way to find social support for those emotions. And a lot of times, especially with the internet nowadays, it's very easy to find people and naturally gravitate towards people out of this massive pool of millions and millions and millions of people that use the internet. It's easy to gravitate towards people who are psychologically going through very similar things to you. And then along comes an idea that seems to really put the pieces of the puzzle together and makes you feel like you have a grasp on what you're going through, like you have something to explain it. And even better with transition and anorexia and stuff like that, you have what you perceive as a concrete solution. So you get these young girls together, and young girls are highly, highly social creatures, more so than boys, even though there is a version of the social contagion amongst boys. It just looks different, and I'm not as familiar with it. But young girls are incredibly social. That period of adolescence is a major period for social development. So the urge to fit in socially and the urge to do things and make sacrifices and put in effort to find social acceptance is very well established through research to be a primary driving, motivating factor in adolescent. So you get all these adolescent girls together on Tumblr where there's no adults, there's no standards. It's like its own freaking universe of its own. You get them all together, they start socializing with who they're going to socialize with, and they naturally gravitate towards other girls who are having the same issues as them. And then they start observing how other girls may be identifying as trans and interpreting themselves as trans. They feel the pressure to identify with some kind of marginalized identity because it's very uncool and it gets you socially ostracized to be, to check all the boxes of privilege. Like me, except woman, but woman isn't really valued as oppressed that much on Tumblr. But straight, white, you don't really want to be any of those categories. And if you are, remember, it's its own little society. You're almost like a second-class citizen. You don't get to have opinions. Any emotional issues that you're going through, they don't matter because your privilege basically cancels it out, theoretically. And so you have a lot of incentive to look for ways to victimize yourself, to legitimize yourself in the social hierarchy. And so there's that aspect, the social aspect, the ideological aspect, all of those incentives to kind of victimize yourself. And then there's also the clinically understood model of social contagion in which young girls interpret their distress in a group setting.
Yeah. Well, is that so? I mean, I've read several studies that have documented the spike in teenage females identifying as something other than their biological sex, whether it's non-binary, trans, genderqueer, agender. And like in the UK, in the Tavistock Center, which is the main gender clinic, they've seen in the last 8 to 10 years a over 5,000% increase among teenage females coming that's I mean, you can take the most, okay, so this is a kind of a Christian podcast. You could take some very liberal atheist, anti-Christian, Bible hating, Jesus hating scientists who say, okay, this is not, there's something going on here. Like, I have no problem with somebody transitioning. I am all for trans rights. This is not just normal. What's going on here? So again, as an outsider looking on, I'm like, this seems pretty disastrous, because these females, it seems like, are being fast tracked in some context, maybe many context, to medically transition, whether it's extended use of cross-sex hormones, maybe even top surgery, typically not bottom surgery. But I mean, these are irreversible in many ways. That just seems, it seems concerning.
Yeah.
Do you see, I mean, you've been through this, and I want to talk about your kind of detransition stage too. We haven't gotten there yet, but I mean, when you look at what's going on, I mean, are you concerned? Are you troubled? Like, I just would love to hear you speak into that, because that, to me, looking on, it just seems very Orwellian. It seems very like, what, does anybody else see this? Like, is this, this, I can't believe we're doing this in a free society. Like, this is crazy that this is happening.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm very concerned, just because I was a part of this identity for so long, and I had so many friends who were exactly the same as me. When I look back on my friends that I used to have when I was trans online, they were going through the same mental process as me. They didn't have that theoretical form of gender dysphoria that might, like we were talking about earlier, where it might be reasonable for someone like that to physically transition. Mm-hmm. They didn't have that. They were, going through, bullying. They had childhood trauma. They had a history of depression, anxiety, eating disorders, body dysmorphia. I had a best friend who, like, now is, she's had all her surgeries and they were botched, and it's so sad, but she was raped in middle school. And it's so clear to me now that the reason that she, did all these things to herself and saw herself the way that she saw herself was because of that. Like, it's so clear to me now. And then when I look at just the hundreds and freaking hundreds of these girls with this exact same pattern that I remember being on Tumblr, and I remember being in LGBT groups that I used to be in, and then I juxtapose that with these skyrocketing numbers, I just know in my heart that 99.9% of the young girls who are transitioning should not be doing so, and it's going to hurt them in some way, physically, psychologically, socially, with their families. It's going to do more harm than good in the long run. And that is my opinion.
Yeah.
I feel it's true. And it might sound a little bit harsh, but that's the truth.
So yeah, this podcast, I don't even know the name of the podcast. It's called Theology in the Raw. We're allowed to be super raw. As my audience knows, I often think out loud, and I might change my mind next week. Like, and it's okay. This is a free thinking podcast, so I appreciate your honesty. I mean, obviously it was kind of a casual remark, but 99.9%, like, that's pretty bold. Like, some people would say, well, no, the studies show that the opposite, that 98% of people are happy with their transition, that yes, you have a few odd cases of detransitioners. You also have a few people that got autism through a vaccine, but that doesn't mean like vaccines cause autism. How would you respond to that perspective that, sure, Helena, that's your story, and maybe you have 2 or 3 friends that have a similar story, but that for the overwhelming majority of we'll just say, I'll just play the narrative, teenagers who are pursuing transition, who have gender dysphoria, if they didn't do this, they would kill themselves. They would commit suicide. They would be self-harming. They would be clinically depressed. And for the overwhelming majority, this is actually helpful. In fact, your message, Helena, is very harmful. How would you I'm sure you get that a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
And for me to respond to that, I'm a cisgender white male. I'm even have one lower check mark than you do on the intersectional hierarchy. Yeah, would love to hear your thoughts on that kind of argument.
So there's a lot to unpack there, because that entire argument that you just laid out for me is not based in any reality or truth whatsoever. So when you look at the studies, and I'm familiar with most, if not all of them, these studies about how many people regret and how many people transition, they are done in an extremely dishonest way. So one of the most popular ones that people get, I think the statistic of like 0.2% of people regret. How they measured regret, first of all, their pool of people that they took this from was people who were actively enrolled in their gender clinic. A lot of the times what happens when you detransition is you just stop going. That's what I did. I just stopped going. I didn't continue going to the same place that was just going to, push me down the same road that I had just been going on, because I was realizing, oh my God, this was a mistake. This is ideological. I was having all these realizations, and there was just no purpose for me to go back to that clinic and continue enrolling myself there. There's no purpose at all. So what they did was they only asked people who were actively going to appointments for their gender transition. Obviously, the amount of people who are going to express regret in that scenario is low, because most of the people who regret don't just keep going back to their same gender clinic. They go find a real doctor. And the other point is that the way that they measured regret was people who get reversal surgeries done. And there's a lot of people who don't get reversal surgeries done because there's not really such thing as a reversal surgery. If you get a mastectomy, you can go get silicone implants, but it's not going to be the same thing as your breasts.
Right.
And a lot of women, they don't want silicone implants. They want their freaking breasts back. So they don't end up doing that. Or with, God forbid, a bottom surgery that you regret, there's really nothing that you can do. Like, it's just, you just have to live with it. And I guess there's technically some experimental something that they can do, but most people, they're not going to put their bodies through that. They already feel damaged enough. They're not going to do it. So they usually just stop going to the clinic. They try to find a real doctor who isn't just going to, be like, oh, I don't know. They try to find a real therapist who isn't going to be like, oh. But most of the time, these people are just kind of stuck, aimlessly wandering around, looking for help. Yeah. And so when you have a study like that it, takes a sample size that is not going to be representative of people, really, and these experiences, and then you measure regret in a way that does not really measure regret and is not really in tune to the experience of people who do regret their transition, to me, that seems intentionally dishonest. It's not an honest attempt to understand what people are going through, how many people are having what kind of experiences. And the data reflects that. Yeah. It doesn't reflect the true reality of what's happening. Because I know just from like my personal friend groups from when I was trans, it's way more than 0.2% of people detransitioning.
Really? Okay.
It's more like almost all of my close friends.
Really?
Close friends, not random people. Close friends desisted before they ended up going on hormones or anything, or detransitioned. And wow. It's just like the community of detransitioners has blown up in the last 2 years, and it continues to blow up. There continue to be more and more and more people. Recently, there were two popular trans YouTubers, trans men who detransitioned. YouTubers that I used to watch, who influenced me, ended up detransitioning recently in the last 6 months or so. One of them is a personal friend of mine now. So when I look at the reality that I see, and I look at the dishonest organization of a lot of these studies, and then I look at the data that these studies are trying to reflect, and then I look at the people who are conducting these studies who are very ideologically biased, that just to me shows that there is no real objective data into this phenomenon, and we need to go by what our eyes see. We need to face reality.
Would you, so when I look at the studies, and I've probably read a lot of the same stuff you have, when it comes to somebody who has experienced severe early onset, ongoing gender dysphoria, where it hasn't desisted through adolescence. Okay, so since they're 2 or 3, that kind of like deep down innate, they go through adolescence, they still experience dysphoria. It is extremely severe. They wait it out. They try to whatever get therapy, and they end up maybe transitioning in early adulthood. That the six, I mean, I'll put it in quotes, success rate of that kind of transition might look different than the population that you're a part of. This kind of, teenage, last few years, rapid onset gender dysphoria, there's some sort of social contagion, and then they transition without really a solid, diagnosis. It's kind of like they come in, and I want to talk to you about how easy it is to get testosterone, but they come in, maybe a half-hour consultation, maybe a 2-hour consultation, but they're diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Bam, they're given the prescription. That those seem like really two different cases. So my question is, are these studies of regret and detransitioning, are they distinguishing between these two very, very different kinds of gender dysphoria? I think the answer is no, that they're not. And in a sense, the rapid onset stuff is so recent that it's almost like we can't do any longitudinal studies. Like, have you been satisfied for the last 10 years? Like, well, I just transitioned 3 years ago. I'll let you know in 7 years. Would that be accurate to say that they're not really distinguishing between two different kinds of gender dysphoria or transgender phenomenon?
Yeah, absolutely. There really isn't any distinction. A lot of the times it's because the studies were just done like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Like there's one that always gets cited that was done in something like 1994. And it's like, that has nothing to do with the current demographics of who is transitioning.
Okay.
Most of these people were adult men, not teenage girls. Right. Very different situation. And then, what was I going to say?
Well, the longitudinal too, there's only been a couple studies, I think, that have been longitudinal that are actually asking people like 10 years after the transition and doing a legitimate sample size with a control group and so on. I don't see that. I mean, the few that have been done have shown a lot more regret, I think, than the ones that, as they're walking out of the clinic, are you happy? Yeah, dude, I'm thrilled. Or even, and maybe this is a good segue, testosterone. When females take testosterone just, from what I understand, chemically produces extreme euphoria short term. Like early on, if anybody injects themselves with high doses of testosterone, that's going to feel amazing for a month, 6 months, maybe even a year. I forget how long. I think you were on testosterone for a couple of years. Can you walk us through just your individual experience with testosterone? What did that look like, feel like?
Yeah. So in the beginning, you're kind of right. I wouldn't describe it as a euphoria because I was still like, I was really unhappy and I was really uncomfortable.
Okay.
But it's almost like a sense of like strength. Like you just kind of feel a little bit more aggressive. You feel a little bit less like sensitive. You feel less like things people say hurt your feelings. You kind of you respond more angrily as opposed to like, when I'm not on testosterone, if someone says something that hurts my feelings, like I'm more likely to, take it personally and get down on myself. Whereas when I was on testosterone and something hurt my feelings, I didn't have that like soft emotional reaction. I had more of a like, what the fuck kind of reaction. And so that does make you feel good in a way. Okay. But for me personally, I didn't really enjoy the way it felt because it was also just so foreign. It was so different. It was so confusing. And it was such a strong and overpowering feeling. It wasn't like minor changes. It was like I felt like a different person.
Wow.
And so that was really, really uncomfortable for me. But for the first few months, I did have like a little honeymoon period. Like probably for the first 3 or so months, I was just like, yay, woohoo, I love my life. I love being trans, woohoo. But eventually, like, yeah, it just caught up to me. And a lot of the like situations in my life that I was avoiding caught up to me. And I just became seriously, severely miserable and dysfunctional.
Really? Mm-hmm. So how long did you maintain testosterone? And then when did you end up getting off of it? And what did that feel like?
I was on it for 17 months, so a little over like a year and yeah, whatever that is, 17 months. From
I was trying to do the math too, and I was like, 3 years, 12 months, like what? I think it's about a year and a half. Let's just say about a year and a half.
yeah, let's go with that. So I was on it from August 2016 to um, late February in 2018.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, that sounds about right. And then, yeah, around late February 2018, I decided to go off of it because I had the big regret washover moment where like I had been trying to repress it and not think about it and just like use all sorts of excuses as to why like it wasn't true, like I wasn't actually regretting it. If I just kept going, it would be okay. And then eventually I had a moment where it just all came out and I had this major reconciliatory moment with how much I regretted what I did.
Wow. How did that how did that go over with your new friend group, the community that you're involved in? Like I've heard that people who used to identify as trans, umbrella terms on some level, when they detransition, the community that once surrounded them and loved them and were committed to them, it doesn't go well. Would that be your experience? Yeah. And why? I'm curious why you think that is, because again, one story is one story is one story. Like this is your individual narrative. We're supposed to respect individuality, individual narratives. Like what is it about your, if it didn't go well, like why can't they say, hey, I love being trans, but if this isn't working for you, then great. How can I support you? That seems like the normal human response, but
it's kind of like two things at play. So one is like the ideological issues. So people are more likely to accept that you've detransitioned if your views on transition and gender and the trans community, if you don't express anything against any of that. If you completely toe the line ideologically, you just simply choose not to be on testosterone anymore, that is more likely to be accepted than if you detransition and you start thinking, hey, this whole thing is kind of a sham. That is oftentimes what really gets you excommunicated, more so than the act of detransitioning itself. But for a lot of people, the changes in beliefs coincide with the detransition because the experience of detransitioning shows you how flawed those beliefs are. So it's rare that you'll find a detransitioner who is, still completely in favor of kind of like the trans, queer theory, social justice sphere. And then on the other hand, there is kind of this feeling, like I described earlier, of like misery loves company. Like you are bonding with people because you're together in that like shared misery of your oppression and your dysphoria and all this kind of stuff. So when someone, leaves that or, finds something better for themselves, it's really easy for people who are still stuck in that place to lash out. Okay. And I know that that's what I did to friends who had detransitioned before I did. Or I remember like I had a friend who she hasn't detransitioned fully, but there was a time when she was having like a crisis moment and she texted me and she was like, I think I need to detransition. Oh my God. Like I think I regret this. And I spent like 2 hours talking to her, talking her down from detransitioning. Oh, wow. And when I look on it, when I look back on it, it's because I was afraid of losing someone who was one of my best friends in that like miserable pool that we shared together. I was afraid of her growing and leaving me. Okay. And so I tried to keep her in there. And there have been other friends who have just totally desisted or detransitioned, and they said, fuck this, I don't want to, this isn't my thing anymore. And I actually did lash out against them because I was like, how dare you? How dare you leave me? Oh, and wow. So there's kind of like it's kind of a feeling like that alongside the intolerance for dissenting opinions.
What would you say? I appreciate that. That's super helpful. What would you say to the critic who thinks that rapid onset gender dysphoria, and again, I guess we haven't really unpacked that term too much. I've talked about it on the podcast before, but this, I mean, you're people like you who have gone through some kind of social contagion, being nudged towards identifying as trans, this rapid spike in teenage females, especially identifying as trans. What would you say to the person who says, I think this is a myth, this is wrong, this is made up, this is harmful? The whole idea of rapid onset gender dysphoria, or everything that you're saying, okay, maybe this is, yeah. What would you say to somebody who just doesn't really believe that this is a thing? First of all, have you seen that? Cause I feel like I see it quite a bit, and I'm kind of shocked. It's like, you can't acknowledge that there are actual trans people, like people would experience dysphoria, and that transitioning might produce a more happy life, for lack of better terms. You can acknowledge that and acknowledge that there is a thing called rapid onset gender dysphoria. What would you say to this person who doesn't believe that this thing exists?
Well, it's really difficult to talk to people like that because oftentimes the reason that they're denying it is for personal emotional reasons. And it's difficult to use a logical argument against them, because if they were capable of thinking logically about this, they would see that it's not a myth, and that, a complete demographic shift from transitioners being majority adult men to being vast majority teenage girls, and then looking at the documented, clinically recognized phenomenon of social contagion in this particular population in the exact same way. Like if you look at, the social circles online that cause girls to develop anorexia, it's such a parallel to the gender dysphoria thing. I've written about this a lot on like my Twitter and stuff. Like I've even taken popular posts from both communities and compared them, and they're like freaking the same thing verbatim about different aspects of the body. So you just look at this, and you just, through virtue of common sense, you can see that there's something going on here. And for someone to completely deny that and say that it's all a right-wing myth and transphobic dog whistles and stuff like that, there's just no really logicking with them.
No, you brought in right-wing. I guess I don't even know the answers to this, but just curious so my audience knows. I mean, would you consider yourself right-wing Republican?
Probably not Republican, but I have more of a conservative, I guess, like orientation. Like I just I gravitate towards, and apart from my social justice phase, that kind of was a weird one-off where I got like possessed. But before that, as a younger person, and then now, like I have more of an inclination towards caution, temperance, like respect for, caste and order and hierarchy and standards and taboos. Like I have kind of a respect for that, and I don't really see progress for the sake of progress as a good thing. I don't really see a lot of the like kind of more emotional, like compassion based approaches to policy and views to be in line with how I look at things. So in that sense, I would say I lean more conservative, but I don't see myself as belonging to any sort of political ideological group.
I love
I wouldn't call myself Republican.
Your Twitter picture is hilarious. you must get so many emails on that. Okay, so for my audience, I don't even know your Twitter handle because I have it like it's just in there, but it's LaCroix or something.
I changed it.
Oh, you did?
Now it's Mental Health Cat.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so you can put it in like the description or wherever you put that stuff. So I changed it so it's legible now. People can pronounce it. It's a good thing.
Okay. Do you still have the same picture of Ben Shapiro?
Yeah, I do.
She's got this girl's got a picture of Ben Shapiro with the meme of like, "Come to me, my trans children." It is so amazing. Like people are like, what? Wait, what? Wait, who? And yet, so like, If I can ask, I mean, sexually, do you identify as lesbian, bisexual, or
Straight.
what's that?
Straight.
You do. I
Yeah.
thought you would. I thought you were bisexual, or is that a whole nother podcast or what?
No, no, it's hard. I used to think I was bisexual, but I realized so I was in a pretty long relationship with a woman who also used to be a trans man, and like we got into a relationship when we were both very confused, and like in my head a trans man was the same as like a biological man, so
Oh
we ended up
wow.
like becoming really close friends, and then I guess just like got confused, and it was a really insane part of my life. So we met like right after my mom and I had a huge fight, a huge falling out, where we both ended up blocking each other and not talking to each
Oh.
other for like 6 to 12 months. And so we met right after this, and I just really needed like support. I really needed someone, and she was going through something very similar, and we were both like on this trans thing. We both called each other like gay trans men or whatever, just very, very confused. And so we ended up just like locking together, like very
Wow.
quickly,
Yeah.
very strongly, just like completely merging together and becoming each other's like support system in a pretty unhealthy way. And so that lasted for a long time,
Yeah.
and it wasn't very good or healthy for either of us. And after we ended up breaking up, or like probably 6 months before we ended up breaking up, I started realizing that like, oh shit, I'm not attracted to women. This is not working. This is not going to happen. This is really unhealthy. The only reason we're together like this is because we kind of bonded over these traumatic experiences that happened to us. And so I started realizing I was straight, and then we eventually broke up. And then now that that's over and I don't have that influencing me anymore, it's very clear that I got majorly confused, and I am pretty much straight as it comes.
So I'm sorry. I know this is not on the air like it's live, but this is going to be on the podcast. I have so many questions. So I mean, and this is going to be for my audience. I'm just gonna ask a question that is just a question. Okay, so don't cancel me. I mean, would you say at least let's just say in your individual experience, was your sexuality influenced by social contagion, or maybe like nature nurture? Are you born gay, or does society make you gay? And all the research says it's a complex blend of both nature and nurture. We don't really know causation. We're complex human beings. Let's not try to separate it all out. But would you say that your life experience played a role in nurturing even your sexual identity? Because that's really and I'm like, just so I identify, I'm a Christian, I'm an evangelical. I do not endorse reparative therapy. I don't think it's
Yeah.
good
I,
or healthy to try to change someone's sexual orientation. And yet I would say that sexual attraction is complex. Lisa
it,
Diamond, a lesbian psychologist, has done a lot of research on the fluidity, especially of female sexuality.
yeah.
And even she came out with a paper in 2015 or 16 saying, I was wrong. Male sexuality is pretty darn or damn fluid as well. I forget how she put it. We're complex. Humans are complex. So that's kind of where I'm coming at it from. And yet I don't want to give fodder to those who run, I don't know, ex-gay ministries or whatever. And I have friends in that arena, and God bless you, whatever. But I'm trying to formulate my question. My question is, in your individual experience, would you say your sexuality also had some level of social contagion or social influence?
So I think that like in terms of sexuality, there is such a thing as like an innate biological sexuality. Like I don't believe that there is anything you could do to me, any brainwashing you could put me under, any therapy that you could do to me that would make me not be physically attracted to men. I don't think that exists. But I do think that especially for women, and especially for women who have either sexual or relational trauma of some sort, there is a way that sexuality can be fluid enough that you can interpret certain strong emotions or connections
Mm-hmm.
as attraction or as arousal even
Hmm.
if you are in, a particular situation. I don't think you can just take the average, like any person, and brainwash them into being a different
Sure.
sexuality.
Yeah.
But I think with the right course of events, the right mental space, the right just conditions that a certain person is in, it is plausible that they can interpret things as attraction that they might
Yeah.
not objectively really pursue in an optimal state of social and mental health.
I read somewhere just recently that there's been studies done on young teenage girls, how it's very common for them to have a crush on their female best friend or something like that. And
Mm-hmm.
that, what does that even mean? Crush, like some sort of emotional attachment, some sort of admiration of their body? Is it jealousy? Is it desire? Is it sex? It's just from what and I think this has been verified by the studies, like female typical, not exclusive, but female typical sexuality blurs together sometimes emotional attraction, fantasy attraction, envy, sexual attraction, romantic attraction. Like all these things are much more blurry, whereas guys typically just want to have sex. Like, and again, not exclusively, but typically they have these real clear compartments of, I want to have sex with this human. I don't want to with this human. I'm
Yeah.
emotionally attracted to that human. I'm not to that. But for women, it can be a lot more blurry.
Yeah.
I don't think that's debated, but it is very unkosher to talk about sexuality in more fluid, flexible terms. I think because of the fear of the ex-gay evangelical kind of doing electric shock therapy to make gay people straight, which again I think is not okay. um,
Yeah.
How much more time do you have, Helen? I'm already taking you over an hour. Are you okay? A couple more.
I'm good.
You're
Yeah.
good. Okay, because I have like about 1,000 more questions, but I'll only limit it to a couple more. What? So I haven't explained my ministry fully to you, the work that I do, but I get a lot of emails from parents, with kids that were basically a 14-year-old Helena, 15-year-old Helena. One in particular, I mean, I could tell you dozens of emails that I get, and it's really,
Too, believe me.
oh my gosh. One recently told me, she lives in California. She said, my 14-year-old daughter has demanded that I go get her testosterone. And if I
Mm-hmm.
don't do this for my daughter and don't use preferred pronouns, don't call her by her preferred name, don't get her testosterone, she's going to report me to child services. And in California, I will lose custody of my child. That's an extreme case, but I get a lot of more versions of that. Basically, my child is so adamant that they are trans, non-binary. What do I do? I guess my question to you is, what would you? I want you to speak to parents here for a second. But almost like, what would you want somebody to have told your 15, 16-year-old self when you were wrestling with all this stuff? Is there hope that a parent can get through to their child? Not necessarily to convince them that they're not trans, but to say, let's not take drastic, irreversible measures
Yeah.
as while you're 15. What would you say to a parent that's wrestling with that?
So this is very complicated. I have written about it a little bit. I have like a little advice column that I do here and there where parents will ask me questions and I'll respond long form. I can actually link you to that and you can put it
Okay.
in your description or on your website or whatever's. I welcome the questions. I do ask that people read over the ones that have already been answered before
Yeah.
sending in theirs, but I do welcome them because I think the most important way of helping individual, young people who are in my position is to strengthen, that family connection and strengthen the family communication, because one of the most destructive things about all of this is the effect that it has on the family. And if my mom could have had someone like me to tell her what to do and what not to do, I would probably be in a better place. But so there's not really one specific thing that you can say. And I think that a lot of parents, when they're faced with this kind of like emergency situation, because it does feel like an emergency, and in many ways it is. Like, if you are literally faced with your child is telling you that if you don't let her take cross-sex hormones that will affect her for the rest of her life, she's going to report you to child services and destroy your whole family. If you're faced with that, that's an emergency. And so what we want to do when we're confronted with an emergency like this is we want to fix the problem. We want to know what to say. We want to know, how do you crack the code? Mm-hmm. How do I change my daughter and make her not do this? How do I fix this? And that approach is not going to work most of the time. Mm-hmm. Because the reason that these girls are doing this is not for logical reasons. They're not doing this because, like they've had some kind of years and years of analysis and therapy that has brought them to this logical conclusion. They're doing this because they're swept up in a highly emotional social current. And a lot of the times, the reason that a young girl can be so angry towards her parent over this trans stuff is because there are some kind of feelings and some kind of tensions between the child and parent that the child is acting out through this. And so when you have the parent focusing on, how do I stop my child from doing this? In the child's perspective, that is just yet another example of the parent not listening, of the parent not caring, of the parent trying to control, trying to domineer. So what you need to do in this situation is look underneath the surface level conversation of, I want testosterone, don't take testosterone. You need to look beneath that, and you need to look at what that child is communicating in this very messed up and complex way. And that's going to involve a lot of humility on your part, a lot of silencing yourself on your part, and a lot of just letting your child talk and listening as much as you possibly can to any kind of information that that child is sharing that is going to help you understand their mental state and understand what emotions they are coming from and what truly is motivating this, because they're not really motivated by wanting testosterone. Their desire for testosterone is motivated by some kind of emotional complex underneath the surface. You need to try to understand that and communicate with that part of the child, if that makes sense. Because if you're just staying on this surface level, arguing over testosterone, telling her, no, it's irreversible, you're going to regret it, that's not addressing the problem. That is just reinforcing the child's belief that you're a transphobe, that you don't care, that you don't want them to be happy. And whether or not they develop that belief through, actual tensions that exist in the family or because of the outside influence of the ideology, that doesn't matter. They still have that belief. And you need to get under it, and you need to meet that child on the very emotional level, and you need to create a safe and open and welcoming space for all of those confusing and crazy and irrational and illogical emotions to just play themselves out. Yeah. And that's the only way that your child is going to process it and get through it and get to a place where they don't feel like they need or want the testosterone or the transition or the name change anymore. Because those emotions that are causing that desire and are causing that reliance on the social circle and the ideology are not going to be strong anymore. Yeah. And they're going to have a foundation, aka the relationship with the parent, a supportive, open, loving communication where the child knows that no matter how crazy or confusing their emotions are, they can bring them to the parent, and the parent will receive it openly instead of criticizing, instead of trying to persuade, instead of trying to change anything. And so that's the most important thing that you need to do. There's not really a thing that you can say or show them. The more you try to show them articles and videos and make rational arguments, the worse it's going to be. And the more angry and upset you're going to get. And so you really need to take care of yourself as a parent. You need to be kind to yourself. You need to, be compassionate with yourself for the mistakes that you've probably made up until this point. But you always have a chance to change your approach and to offer your child that safe, emotional landing space that they're looking for in the trans community. Yeah. Because I promise you, if they can get that from their parent, they will prefer that over the trans community anytime.
Helena, for somebody who doesn't identify as a Christian, you sure sound a lot like Jesus. I mean, Yeah, that could be a whole other podcast. That was brilliant advice. I'm curious because I have recommended on a couple of occasions parents who have kids in your situation, early teens, wrestling with their gender identity. I have recommended, you know what? They're like, hey, can you talk to him? I'm like, no, yeah, you don't want a white, straight, cisgender male I'm 44. That's just, no matter what I say, it's not going to go well. But I do know these four young 20-something females who have been through this. It's called the Peak Resilience Project, and I push people to your videos as maybe if they hear somebody who is a few years ahead of where exactly they are. They don't have an explicit religious commitment, so they can't say, oh, a bunch of religious homophobes. They're just like, no, there's people that are just human and just have been through this. Have you, is that good advice or no? Would you say that like watching you and Dagny and your friends, is it Kiara and others, like, to me, it's super powerful. Like, here's several people who have kind of been through this, can speak the language, know the language. Would you recommend that or not necessarily? Like having a 15-year-old watch some of your guys' videos, like have you seen success from that or no?
I would recommend showing it to the parents so that the parents can have some more insight,
Okay.
but I wouldn't recommend the parent showing it to their kid.
Okay.
And that is because there is a certain amount of mental readiness that a child needs to have to be open to something like that. And despite the fact that, yes, it's true, we were in that position and we came out the other side and here is our wisdom and analysis from all that, a child who is closed-minded, their literal freaking thinking skills are not developed to the point where they can entertain ideas that are different from the kind of like emotional, irrational ideas that they're having right now, because a 15-year-old brain is very different from a 21-year-old brain. It's just going to make them feel more attacked, more misunderstood. You want to avoid anything that will come across to the child as you're trying to change them. You're trying to persuade them. You want everything you do to be about inviting. You want to invite that child in, not give them stuff and push stuff onto them from inside you, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Helena, you're amazing. This has been, I want to, we'll close out. Thank you so much for being on the podcast and the YouTube channel. I can't wait for people to watch this. And I so appreciate your heart, your honesty, and your wisdom. Seriously, I wasn't just joking. Like your advice and knowledge. I just want lots of people to tap into that, because I think in the work that I do, I've got a lot of people that just need some help, and I think they're going to really cling to this conversation. So thank you so much for giving up an hour and 17 minutes of your time to come talk to us. Where can people find you again if they want to know more about you?
Yeah, so my Twitter that's the only real social media that I use. It's Mental Hell Cat. So Mental Hell Cat.
Nice.
It's kind of a pun on mental health care, but.
And Peak Resilience, is that, I mean, you guys don't put out a lot of videos, but it's there on YouTube. I mean, is that still a thing that's happening? I mean,
it's still on YouTube, but we have disbanded.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just due to like wanting to do our own things, there was some disagreements within the group that just weren't really reconcilable.
Okay. Okay. That's Peak Resilience. P-I. How do you spell peak?
Q-E-E.
So there's several videos you guys already have out that would be super helpful, even if it's not something that's continuing on. So thanks so much for being on, Helena. I appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Take care.